Hello, and welcome to a Cannaconvo episode of Cannabis Last Week. I'm your host, John Puro. This is brought to you by Global Cannabis Times. We are doing an interview here from the Benzinga Cannabis Capital Conference, the one and only Benzinga Cannabis Capital Conference. And I have the pleasure and honor sitting down here with Matt Hawkins from Entourage Effect Capital, an OG, right? I would say, right?
Yeah, I might
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. So I'll let Matt give a little bit more of a little bit of a bio so you understand the depth of experience here in the industry. And then we're going to talk about some really interesting, pressing topics.
Thank you for having me. And thanks to Benzinga as well. Yeah, Matt Hawkins, Entourage Effect Capital, founder, managing partner. We've been investing in the industry since 2014. Investing out of our third fund now. We've got multiple special purpose entities for close to 60 investments over the course of that time. We invest up and down the value chain. It really isn't a sector that we haven't either looked at or invested in. So just happy to be here and talk to you about what's going on right now.
So I think that's a good place to start, right? Yeah. What is going on right now? Because it is, even though there's a lag time between when we record and post, it is a, bit of a challenging time in the industry right now in terms of, license holders and all sorts of aspects of the industry. You have the macroeconomic factors like inflation impacts where people are spending their money as consumers. You have industry specific things such as Russia and Ukraine producing 30% of the world's fertilizer, increasing costs on the cultivation side. And then in mature markets, this kind of race to the bottom on the retail side with, I would say, like disorganized discounts. And, I have on my podcast every single week the Maramula, or rolling in the green section for business. And those deals, they've slowed down. So from your position, unique position of experience, what are your thoughts on where we are now, in general?
Yep. Well, everything you said is correct. And it's not just the malaise of the cannabis industry right now, but it's the macro environment that we're living in that has been unlike anything we've seen since cannabis, legal cannabis started.
Great point.
Just when you think you're starting to get tailwinds, another headwind appears, and this is one of them. You put on top of that the fact that there is very little, if any, new capital entering the space at all levels, whether it's the public markets, just from retail investors. Retail investors have been burned and they're skittish. When we've raising our third fund, it's the hardest money I've raised so far. And so it just tells you something that there's a huge dearth of capital that's from, that affects companies that are startups, yeah, all the way to, the big boys that are the domestic MSOs. And so it's a huge problem, and it's not going to change unless something happens both regulatorily, federally, and the states realize that the error in their ways with their, taxation and regulation platforms.
So you touched upon a couple, points there. One thing that I think is interesting what you're saying, right? The third fund versus the other ones is that the fact of the matter is that this industry is kind of sexy, right? There's a little an element of, This is a legalization of a drug, right? And there are people who are jumping in on, who have some money or jumping in a single state to own a piece of a license, right? Or there are investors, right, that see the legalization of a drug, which has never really happened like this before. And, there's this first round and series, of money that comes in. And then there's a greater understanding of the complexity of the industry, the hurdles in terms of, 280E. I always give the disclaimer, this is nothing against the regulators. It's nothing personal, right? I would never want to have their job because they're juggling competing interests, but inevitably, right, the effects, and as a lawyer, someone who deals with this all the time, the unintended consequences, lead to you have to strategize. So some of that, maybe that sheen is off a little bit, for certain people. And, it's still state by state, right? I'm sitting in New York, right? Financial capital of the world. So that's actually an interesting question. And there is money sitting there that there will be people investing in, New York as it launches for the first time. But then also, what are your thoughts in terms of how the financial capital of the world and I guess the media capital of the world coming online in and of itself could theoretically impact the current environment, and its challenges.
Short of them getting crazy involved in lobbying, I think it doesn't move the needle as much as we might think. And the reason is that until the federal illegality veil is lifted, institutional capital, by definition, can't enter the space. And so that's just the way it's going to be. And so things have to change. But now the good news is that the Blackstones, the BlackRocks, all the big boys that are just sitting there in New York are going to start salivating even more than they already are. Yep. And so maybe they can effectuate change. I don't know. Maybe their voices are louder than mine. I can guarantee it. So we'll see.
So obviously, ultimately, the big kahuna is federal legalization. That will change everything. Who knows what of the pharmaceutical companies or the tobacco will happen. But let's talk about incremental change that's actually possible. So everyone, safe banking has passed the House and, in one form or another, 7 different times. But I am finally hopeful, specifically because of Cory Booker's 180, right? And frankly, I think, like Tahir Johnson, one of my interviewees, my good buddy on the U.S. Cannabis Council, hammering home the idea that safe banking doesn't just benefit the biggest companies in the industry, that it greatly impacts, minority-owned businesses. I covered one data point, right? There's a survey of the entire industry, and they said, what was your number one concern? 70% said banking. Yep. Right? These exorbitant fees that they're being charged, it creates these crazy situations like, I said it with a Boston accent because I'm a Yankees fan. The curious case of the Ahmed Ka, right? Okay. That it was a California armored car that went to, if I recall correctly, Missouri, right, to pick up cash to take it to Colorado, and the feds arrested them and seized the money. Yeah. Crazy things like that. So now I'm hopeful, right? Safe banking, they're going to team it up. I've always said, like, safe hope, throw in the expungements, throw in some, help for small businesses. And this could actually happen during the lame duck session. So my question is, any thoughts in terms of, well, one, if you think it could happen, and 2, what potential impact? And I know that we're being, speculative, but sure. I'm curious with your,
I think that I share your optimism that it's closer than it's ever been. Yeah. However, I've been just so disappointed, multiple times on thinking that we were close, and we really never were. Some of the scuttlebutt around here, it seems like, just as I have been reading and been told, I mean, there seems to be more communication between the two parties on getting something done. So that's very encouraging. Now, what will this bring if it happens, or when it happens? It's going to happen. It's just a matter of when. And so when it happens, you will have, obviously, those exorbitant fees go away. There'll be competition amongst the banks in terms of just, business accounts, and business services, be able to open up a, checking account and not worry about getting shut down because you either didn't disclose that it was a cannabis account, or, not being able to get wires in from banks that don't allow it. All that nonsense that we're dealing with right now. But the other things that are quite possible are that you're going to have banks that are being willing to do traditional lending to businesses that we don't have access to right now. I mean, we can't, get lines of credit. We can't get, working capital lines. We can't do, factoring in any real way. I mean, there's just so many different ways to manage your cash flow as a business that other industries use hourly that we can't use at all in the industry. And so those are really, really big things that can drive your profits. So that's number one. Number 2, does this open up the exchanges in the US? I don't think so, but it could, and it could get people to the point to where they just think, we're just going to do this. Yeah. And we'll see.
I mean, I think right now, right, it's a function of comfort level, right? So, you have certain banks that are at the forefront here and they have that comfort level. I remember talking to a friend at one bank and he was like, oh yeah, we service the porn industry. So, hey, we're going to go into this too, right? There's that appetite for a little bit of risk, sketchiness. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. We're not sketchy. We're just, we're righting the wrongs of the politicized war on drugs, right? I mean, that's what we're doing. And that's why we have a unique capacity for good in this industry. So I think that that's an interesting, point. And let's also not forget that the safe and safe banking means something because people are being held up at gunpoint. I covered a story a couple of weeks ago. 4 dispensaries, I think, in one night were hit in Missouri, armed robberies. it's just, it's crazy. And it shouldn't be that way, that people are literally putting their lives at risk. So safe and safe banking means something. So I'm also just, curious from your perspective. I always like playing this. I can never make a decision, since my, podcast is all about terrible, terrible puns / dad jokes. If I should call it Smokerdamus or Tokerdamus, anybody who appears gets a vote. I'm curious to know, your thoughts in general in terms of where things are going over the next couple of years, right? How do we emerge from this current difficult section caused by the macro impacts and the industry specific stuff? How do you think that we get out of this? How does it change the current investment climate? Who is that favoring, right? Debt, equity, where's the segment of it that is making a lot of more sense because of this environment? So let's split it up into two.
Sure.
Right. I mean,
let me take the latter part first.
Exactly.
So the reality is that this cycle we're in right now, if we want to call it that, squarely benefits capital because valuations have come down. There is a clear delineation between winners and losers right now. And the winners need capital to continue scaling in advance of what could happen legislatively. The other side of the coin, and that helps, that benefits both debt and equity. So now to get down to a micro level between equity and debt, the credit side, obviously there's a whole bunch of players now that are, providing real estate debt, which is great. That's a huge, huge component of creating value and unlocking value, on your balance sheet. But let's face it, they're charging pretty high rates. And so the companies don't benefit from that in the long run. It gives you a whole bunch of capital right out of the bat, but there's usually a lot of covenants in there that you got to be careful about. And a lot of it's interest reserves. A lot of it's just the cost of capital in general. So the credit guys can benefit, but that's also where equity benefits too, in that you can say, why would you be taking, that kind of debt that you can barely afford to pay back when, we can provide capital on the equity side. Now, granted, they're going to be parting with ownership, but that's, it comes with the turf. That's right. So the point is that having said all of that, there's still not enough capital to support the opportunities that exist right now. And so that's not going to change until something happens legislatively. And it's our belief that with the patches of the Safe Banking Act, that's going to bring in a lot of new family office money, a lot of, I think there's a lot, the broker dealer community, gets involved. A lot of the RIAs, start, feeling like it's not as risky to put their clients in deals. But until then, we're kind of stuck.
I think that's a really interesting point, is that there's not enough capital right now to support. You have states like New Jersey, New York coming online, right? And I mean, one thing is, institutional investment, some of these, they could go into the REITs, right? They could be investing in the REITs, and then the REITs are, as you're saying, they're doing well in this environment, it seems like, because people need to be able to build out their facility. But there's this other side of the coin, right? That if you're getting too much into the debt as a launching business, right, with all the difficulties that there are going forward, as you said, unless something happens more on a macro level, what we could find ourselves 1 to 2 years down the road, and that can all hit, right, theoretically, right? I have a question for you. Do you think that if less licenses were handed out on a state-by-state basis, that would support the overall health of the industry going forward?
That's a really, really tough question, because then you start getting into, and this is going to get me in trouble, but who cares? But I think the answer is probably yes. Yeah. But it's exactly what we're trying to avoid too, in that, limited licensing issuing is great for investors. It's probably great for the entrepreneurs to get those licenses. Yeah. And it's probably great to walk before you run in these states that don't know what the heck they're doing regulatorily. Yeah. Having said that, that's going to tamp down the amount of social equity applicants. It's going to tamp down all of the different things that a lot of the progressive side of the political spectrum want, and not just want, but demand. And so the very things that you and I were talking about this earlier, but the very things that, that the far left are saying these have to be included in what we're doing, are the very things that are creating the space between the haves and the have-nots in the industry right now. And some of this is chicken and the egg stuff, but it's a really, really tricky question, because going the flip side of it, if there's too many licenses issued, there's going to be complete failure because there's not enough capital to support these companies to begin with. How do we handle this? And it's a tough one.
So then we're talking along the lines essentially that, rather than handing out more limited licenses, that the market will bear out, right? Insufficient capital, all these hurdles, the success rate of these businesses.
And at the end of the day, this is capitalism. This is an emerging market that has going through some significant growing pains, but capitalism prevails. And so we can put a bow on all this and make it seem like we're doing as much good as we can, which we, as an industry, we are. But at the end of the day, I mean, the cream rises to the top. And so it's just a matter of, how big that cream is on top of that cup of coffee, because we don't know yet. But until there's more capital entering the space, that cream's not going to be very thick.
Yeah. I agree. It makes sense. It's just the way that it's going to, bear out. The success rate might go down. Yeah. I mean, look where we were, right? I mean, covering on the podcast, right? There were so many stories for such a long time about, an MSO jumping in and buying a 5 dispensary chain for tens of millions of dollars, right? Or a beverage company getting, purchased for, tens of millions of dollars. And that has slowed down to a trickle. But, we might be going to this next phase because of the macro industry specific factors where success rate of these licenses that get handed. I mean, what we're even seeing in Jersey right now is, this concept of the conditional license, right? You could go in, you could check certain boxes, you could wait for the property and the municipal approval down the road. And New Jersey is the densest state, right? So there's just not enough property. So you're going to have people fall by the wayside even before they actually get to convert to a full license. And it's not necessarily the only state that's like taking that approach, to kind of remove a certain barrier of entry right at the beginning, one of the largest expenses. And then New York is doing its own, fakakta. Don't get me started. I mean, the wonderful regulators, very, very nice. It's just unfortunately that there's going to be some large unintended consequences in terms of how they're trying to launch it. So circling back, right? We're going down this path a little bit already, but what do you prefer, Tokerdamus or Smokerdamus? Okay. All right. So there you go. So Matt, put on your Tokerdamus hat, cap, joint, whatever it is, that I should hand to people when I ask them to do this, a green robe. And, tell me, we're talking along these lines, right? And it is an immature industry still. Yeah. Right? I mean, even in places that we consider quote unquote mature markets, they're still making significant changes to the regulation. Like look at California, for example, right? The cultivation tax, where how many years in, revenue neutral makes it not necessarily as impactful as it sounds when you say eliminating the cultivation tax. But where is the industry going in whatever, extent you want to give your insight on it?
So I'll start by saying there's an amazing article written by the LA Times that just came out about just the magnitude and scope and the danger of the illicit market in California. And that doesn't get the attention of the state regulators. I don't know what is, because it's everything we talked about. You mentioned, having the word safe and safe banking. I mean, look what's happening in Oakland. I mean, it's a war zone. And so I say all this because I think we are arguably a $25 to $30 billion domestic industry right now that should easily be a $60 or $70 billion industry at this very moment, but it's being dominated by an illicit market that's still thriving. And in order for that to get tamped down, things have to change. And that goes from all the way down to the municipal level, to the state level, to the federal level. And that's a huge, huge lift. So in the meantime, the industry is now open to all of these new states in the Midwest and the Northeast. You're getting traction down in the Southeast. Florida may even open up, 2024. But the industry, from a legality standpoint, you're at a point now where the majority of Americans live in a state where it's legal, and it's getting to the point where it's damn near almost over 50% of Americans live in a state where it's, from a population standpoint, where it's rec legal.
Yeah.
So regardless, the court of public opinion is there. And so voices have to be heard. And ultimately, that's the way politics work, is that, constituents, drive the decision-making of the politicos. I found it fascinating several months ago when Bill Maher said that the Republicans might just steal this issue from the Democrats. And who knows? But you know what? It's a damn good idea. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'll go out on a limb and say that my Tokerdamus, is that what I said? Tokerdamus will say that in the next 4 years, the Republicans may be the leaders on getting something pushing through because the states' rights faction of that party might be able to see this through. And I think because the problem we have with on the left side of the aisle is the far left pulling it too far away from being pro-business. And we need something to happen that can be a catalyst to make it more pro-business. And let's face it, the Republican Party is more pro-business at the end of the day. So we'll see. I don't know, but that's my Tokerdamus. That's a stretch, but who cares?
No, I think it makes sense. So many things as jumping off points to touch upon there, right? But to, talk about the federal and going back in terms of Republicans, essentially stealing this issue, playing the thought experiment, right? What happens if one house of Congress goes to Republicans, right? Can safe banking still pass? And doing like this deep dive episode, right? Thinking out all the angles. The reason why, right, I think it's so difficult for the two sides to come together is ultimately voter demographics, right? Black voters specifically are a huge, important voting bloc in the Democratic Party, and they are the community that I think you would say has been most negatively impacted by politicized war on drugs, right? That is not a demographic that Republicans feel the need to cater to. I mean, I guess Trump did to some extent, but Trump has his own Trumpian logic. That's not going political too much, hopefully. And it seems to make sense in the idea of, states' rights is something for conservatives, right? That you would think what they would want, but it's that puritanical, right? It's funny how the war on drugs really, well, I guess Anslinger, right, to some extent, but, Nixon really, right? The war on drugs was for political purposes, in terms of, certain ends. And it's like, a couple generations in, it's fully entrenched as, drugs are bad. Okay. And so I think that's really the only thing holding it back. When you look at polling, Agreed. Right? Texas tracks with the national average of 2/3 of voters supporting adult use.
Let me comment because I live in Dallas, Texas. And so, I mean, look, hell, I grew up Republican. I mean, that's just where I live. And now I'm nowhere near what I was politically even 10 years ago. But I will say this, in that as long as Dan Patrick is the lieutenant governor of the state of Texas, it will never, ever get to the Senate floor in Texas because he is so far right. Yep. And that's so we talked about the progressive left. Well, Dan Patrick embodies the far right. And it does not represent what the political or the constituents in Texas, regardless of where they sit on what side of the aisle, the state of Texas wants some type of legalization. Yeah. And they're just not getting it because Dan Patrick won't listen.
Yeah. Which is a shame, right? And it's like, at what point, do the numbers get like? I like the.
That's why I think we're getting that tipping point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like I like the idea of certain, of the conservatives. There's Louisiana state politician, right? He wants a way looking at it. He commissions a poll, right? And the poll of his specific demographic, his voters, his constituents, and it polls positively, right? So then that leads to incremental progress, in the StateHouse or whatever. And I still think Louisiana will be the first of the deep South states to turn, and that'll be big, theoretically, in terms of the national stigma and everything. The other thing is like, when I do the podcast, I'm like, I learned way more than I ever wanted to know about how ballot initiatives are done in state legislature. And one of the issues with Texas is that the state Congress only meets every other year for like 3 months. Yeah. And so it's just like,
they have a history of having special sessions because they can't get everything done and they get done. That costs the taxpayers money and all. It's an S show.
Yeah. I like it. Yeah. So I think we are hitting our time right now. Thank you so much. If there are any final thoughts that you wanted to share or anything on any of these points.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I've mentioned this in the panel I was just on, but I didn't get into this because of politics. Got into this to make money for our investors, and we're capitalists, like I said. But having said that, I've found that politics plays a part in our success. And so I've started to get more active on social media. I've started to get involved in some of the organizations where there's some type of lobbying going on. And I would just encourage everybody to reach out to their representatives and say your piece, with Republican or Democrat.
Write a letter, right? Let's take it back. Write a letter. Don't send an email. No, okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Matt. It was a real pleasure. And thank you to the host at Benzinga again. But thank you to the lovely Lane lads at Benzinga and everything. So, all right, signing off. And as always, I like to say, stay grassy, my buds, and we'll see you at the next episode.